Once again, it's a pleasure to kick off our next panel, our next session. It's my pleasure to host and to lead a conversation with a couple of very fine professionals here on the topic of AI risk management. So again, my name is Todd Tucker, and I'm going to drive a conversation with Dr. Runli Guo. She has a PhD in AI. And what fascinates me about this is that she earned that PhD back in was it 2002? Yeah. So she's been living this for a long time, but she's also a former CISO. So, and then we have Andrew Reaver with Databricks, and Andrew works with obviously an amazing technology company that is really instrumental to AI, and he also works very closely with one of our board members, Omar Khawaja. I always get his name wrong, but Omar, on our board from Databricks, who's the field CISO. So I'm going to have a seat, and we're just going to have a conversation about AI risk, and hopefully we'll leave some time for questions from the group. Let me just start with kind of a basic question. There's a lot of regulations globally, but especially here in Europe and the UK, obviously with the EU AI Act, and then there's some that have implications for AI, DORA, NIS2, et cetera. How do you two look at these regulations and their impact on AI and the adoption of AI and addressing risk? And maybe, Andrew, starting with you, kind of as you guys look at regulatory compliance around AI, what are your experiences there?
Yeah, sure. So I guess we've kind of pivoted a little bit at Databricks because kind of like early when ChatGPT came out, everyone wanted their own ChatGPT, and it was all about kind of building like a large language model. And we kind of did some iterations with that, more to prove that it was possible than to build a competitor to ChatGPT. But actually, like over time, it was kind of proven that with like RAG and compound AI models, like using like open source models, potentially fine tuning them, you could get pretty much similar performance to the like state-of-the-art large language models for a lot less cost, and you can kind of fine-tune them to your domain. And so if we'd have carried on down the path of building our own models, then we would have some very direct, specific requirements under the EU AI Act because we'd be building general-purpose AI. Because we pivoted kind of away from that and we provide just a general purpose platform that customers implement their own use cases, I think one of the things that I see that there is a bit of confusion and a bit of kind of like not everyone kind of on the same pages about, and I'm not a lawyer, but I've read the EU AI Act. I think like my interpretation of the EU AI Act is it's not designed to regulate any use of AI. It's designed to regulate the use of AI in largely in very specific scenarios. So if you're using AI to decide which candidates to interview, then that would be potentially a high-risk use case, and so you'd have a load of regulation. Because we provide a general-purpose platform, we don't really have visibility of what customers are using the platform for, and so we don't have as many direct kind of requirements from the EU AI Act. And so we've had to upskill massively, more from a regulatory perspective than a technology perspective, because we've been doing kind of like machine learning and things like that for a while. But a lot of our upskilling has been not because we have this huge list of requirements that we need to be, it's more how we help customers understand the requirements that they have through using the platform.
And from a regulatory perspective, what are kind of the key things that they're asking, and do you feel like they're struggling with from a regulatory or compliance perspective?
Yeah, so I think the one thing that I think like quantifying risk, both in terms of kind of like different types of risks. So you have an AI use case. What's the risk of success of that use case? Like how much, let's say it's about making your company money, how much money will that bring your company? What's the risk of failure? If everything goes wrong, what's the risk of that?
Yeah.
And I know like you've got your Fair Air framework to help customers understand that. And then what's the risk of doing nothing? Because I do think that we're in this space where it's different to other risk management exercises where there is a choice, which is just, actually, this is a bit too risky. We're going to see where we are in 5 years' time. I do think like that there is a company over the next 20 years, companies that embrace AI will be the most successful companies, and companies that don't will struggle against their competitors. And so there's also a risk of do nothing. And I think quantifying that level of risk, also quantifying the use case level of risk under the things like the EU AI Act. I see companies spending a disproportionate amount of time applying the same due diligence to what would, under the Act, be considered a no-risk or limited risk use case, and having like huge questionnaires about kind of like how models have been trained, when actually it's like a relatively simple use case that would be considered like limited risk. But because this is all new and things are changing and we're kind of a bit risk averse naturally, we're spending kind of like, we're just seeing it as it involves AI, so here is our like huge compliance framework for that, as opposed to actually this is a coding assistant. It may be used even to implement a high risk use case, but there's still a human in the loop. They're still deciding what code actually gets moved into production. It's fundamentally not too different from someone copying code from Stack Overflow. And so, like, I think it's that. It's like people trying to figure out how to correctly quantify risk, and because we're struggling to find an easy way of doing that, just spending disproportionate amounts of time on, like the same amount of time on a potentially high risk use case to a potentially limited risk use case.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Overkill in some situations where it's not needed. Runli, like you, like I said earlier, you have a fascinating background, given the work as being a CISO for a large company. And now you have a startup that you're, wearing many hats. We were talking about that earlier. Tell us, what does AI DIONIC do? And then what's your view of the regulatory impact on AI, maybe as you work with clients?
Thank you, Todd. Yeah, thank you for the nice introduction. And so my journey has been quite weird. So in most people's standards, so I went from an analyst, I actually started with PCI compliance. So compliance was my field to start with. And so after my PhD, I didn't follow the path of AI because at that time, AI wasn't very popular. So I went on a journey from a PCI compliance officer and then, operational security analyst and all the way up to head of security and then global head of digital cyber for Marsh McLennan, 80,000 people. And then come down again with, if you look at the size of the organizations I worked for, although my title got more fancy, but the size of the company, drops until now. We have 2 founders. So that's my story. In terms of compliance, I think, I agree with you about not one size fits all. It's all about the size of the company and, what's relevant to you. If you think about the PCI compliance I was working on, we were literally, because I was working for a level 1 PCI payment service provider, and that was our survival. So if we don't have that tick in the box every year, we can't operate. So compliance is very, very critical. And then you talk about risk once you have met the compliance. However, when, things moved on a bit, when I was a CISO for Get, which is taxi ride hailing, you probably have taken a taxi with them. Then operational security resilience is the most critical because, on the other side, I think it's, although I was mainly focused on cybersecurity, but one side of me is thinking about resilience. So my program at the time I set up was cyber resilience program, because it's important to, if we are attacked or we are, have some kind of events, we need to be able to bounce back. We need to be able to be operational. So that was the most critical. On the other side of the coin, compliance was again very important, because if we weren't compliant to certain things, we won't get our large corporate clients. They won't let us have the business. So it's all driven by the business. It's not about which one is more important. It all depends on who you're working for. So that's my perspective. Hope that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes total sense. I mean, I'm hearing kind of the same thing. On one hand, you find, sometimes companies are, it's that overkill on use cases that maybe don't have an AI-related risk, or not one that's, worth the investment of time. And then on the other hand, you're impacting what you can do with, with your clients and meeting your business objectives.
I forgot to mention about AI DIONIC. I'm sorry. Can I just
please do.
have the mic back a little bit? So what we do is actually different from what I have done in the past. So we are an agentic AI platform to help private equity firms to source deals and carry out due diligence. I mentioned to Todd during break, due diligence is a form of risk management. So we're all relevant anyway. So here we are. Thank you.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So this is a broad question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. So I'm going to start with you, Runli. What do you feel is the biggest risk, at least that you're hearing from maybe your clients, in your conversations, the biggest risk related to AI?
Yeah, I thought about this. So I was looking at this question on the train, actually. I was thinking, what is the biggest risk? Because I don't see there's one single risk. I see a lot of risk, and I couldn't really decide which one is the biggest. So this is what I thought about it. So first of all, putting my multiple hats on. I've been an AI researcher. I've been a cybersecurity professional, and now I became a CEO for a startup. So all of these multiple hats blend into this multifaceted view. And I think, again, if you are sitting from your perspective as a risk professional, you want to know about everything in your organization, because the traditional way of thinking risk and break it down into a slice of this, slice of that is not going to work, because they all interconnected. And you're going to have a very, a single point of failure, and then you didn't capture. So it's important to understand everything, and then really work with the organization, and don't think of it as just risk, and think about it as two sides of the same coin. There's opportunity. As Andy mentioned, if you miss the opportunity, and then it will cause business failure anyway, so it has to be blended view of, across the whole organization.
Yeah. Do you see a risk in particular that stands out, especially among your clients?
So I think the biggest risk is going to vary, whether it's from the perspective of an individual, a company, a country, depending on. From my experience working with customers, the biggest risk that I see for kind of across all uses of AI is lack of data governance. If you have bad data, you have bad AI. Mm-hmm. And that's been a problem that's kind of we haven't really solved for many years, or we have in kind of pockets, and we even have in some organizations, but most organizations will have kind of data that they they're not confident about the quality of, or there might be bias issues and things like that they don't understand.
Yeah.
So I think that is the one that I see a lot of time. When you kind of debug back through the steps of a model that isn't performing how you want. Most often it comes from the data.
Yeah, yeah. Do you find that AI is introducing new challenges in regards to data quality? Like, does it change that problem, from kind of traditional data quality challenges?
Yeah, absolutely, because I think there are things that are, like, historically we only had to care about things that were like deterministic, and we can kind of build those capabilities into our platform, but like an AI model is probabilistic, and so it's harder to predict what, like from a bias perspective, if we know that our like data is weighted towards a certain type of person, then we can, like from a deterministic approach, we can like reasonably, like we can exactly run a query and get a different result. Maybe we should actually just like do a fairer split of the data, etc. But from an AI perspective, it's much harder to predict what will happen, and then once we start getting the results, kind of like see how the data influences those. But
I thought about perhaps the biggest risk is not to get on board, because AI is at the beginning of ChatGPT. It was more like an intern, and you have to teach it, and then it will get better. But right now, so it's become much, much smarter. If you have used the latest model, and you will be amazed, shall we say? And then applying something like, for example, my company uses the agentic AI, which is a complex workflow with a lot of agents behind the scenes. So it can do so much more, even though we have a very small team, but we have achieved a huge amount just because we deploy the latest technologies. So what I'm saying is there are still a lot of fear around using AI, but if you don't get on board, then you will be left behind. That's probably a very big risk. I want to quote something that I watched last night. Angela Duckworth, she gave a commencement speech at a university, and she said, AI can be a crutch and also can be a coach. So use it wisely.
That's good. I think when there's uncertainty around something, right? Like we don't entirely, we can't predict exactly how this AI function will work, et cetera. So when you're looking at organizations that are hesitant, is there a danger that they're avoiding the use of AI, but not considering the risk that they have with their existing kind of processes, right? No process, no technology is perfect. And you could say, well, we're going to continue to do this the old way because we're not sure about this AI-driven, agentic AI kind of, process. Is there a danger that there's actually more risk with the old way of doing things?
I would say so, yes. I think with anything, you have to move with time. And so for example, when you are having integrations with, let's say you are a retail company and you are having something more integrated and can do self-checkout. You can already do self-checkout, but now it's one click, or now maybe you can maybe you can have robots on the floor. So I think what I'm trying to picture is there is a future that's gonna happen one way or the other, and we have to get on board to understand what that looks like. How do we secure that? Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally. It does. It makes me think of, too, the advice in the last session from Alex at EY of, we have to be prepared for when things, there's always that uncertainty. There will be things that happen. We have to be prepared. And I know this is kind of off the cuff, but when we look at AI, how do you prepare for the uncertainty there in terms of like our ability to respond to what might happen? Have you guys, dug into that, Andrew?
Yeah. So I think a lot of this kind of comes back to like all of the things that you can do like during the kind of like training process and the continuous monitoring that you can do for an AI like model in use. So you've got kind of like all of the like metrics that you need to like understand what's happening and kind of like kind of like debug what is essentially like from particularly when you start to add multiple agents and kind of things. And so there's lots of new, I don't want to get too techie, but there's lots of new frameworks come out that like support kind of like trace aspects where you can kind of like debug, step through like an agentic workflow and kind of see like, oh, this is the response I got from this agent, and then this agent kind of retrieved this data from my vector database and then passed that to this agent and this agent. And so I think kind of like a lot of the step is kind of like understanding what's gone wrong first before figuring out how to respond. And then like the other thing that I would say is like there is a kind of tendency to see everything to do with AI as completely new, and so kind of like but actually like say for example if you take some like emerging AI risks, like a model supply chain risk is very similar to a software supply chain risk. In some ways, prompt injection is very similar to SQL injection. In some ways, kind of like things like data poisoning and label flipping attacks and things like that are very similar to just broad data governance issues as well. And so, like, there is actually, like, rather than having to like reinvent everything, so you already have ways to deal with kind of cyber incidents and security incidents, to investigate them, to kind of follow them up and things like that. Not everything is new. Like there's
parallels.
And like AI, as if I come back to, if you have bad data, you'll have bad AI. It's built on the foundations of software engineering, data engineering, both of which are well understood in terms of how you manage risk, how you manage kind of change management and things like that. So like you don't have to start from scratch. There's still like there's a huge chunk of stuff that we understand quite well, how to manage risk and like how to like manage incidents and respond to incidents that you can have kind of you can leverage just because there's an AI model that pops out at the end doesn't kind of negate that.
Yeah, that's interesting. I want to ask one more question, then we'll take a question or two from the audience.
Sure.
But just strategies, as you two, have been focused on AI adoption and risk. What strategies or strategy do you recommend to organizations that you work with for addressing, risks related to AI?
So, do you want to start? Or? I think with risk, so obviously there are lots of facets. So security, privacy, and ethics. The fact that I'm thinking from your perspective rather than my builder perspective as an AI startup. So I think that there are lots of things to consider. So what to prioritize? So go back to FAIR. FAIR is a common language, allow you to speak the same thing so people can understand which one is the most important. So I would say, just work with people and make sure that they are on the same page as you.
Yeah, good.
Yeah, absolutely. I think like the prioritization, quantifying risk is a massive one. I would say like don't start from scratch. Just as people aren't really training, or only a few companies in the world are now training large language models from scratch. Don't start your AI strategy from scratch. It will be expensive, it will take ages. There's loads of stuff out there that you can leverage. So to quantify risk, you've got like your FAIR framework, which sounds like an environmental policy, but like is actually about like quantifying AI risk and most specifically like the financial implications of AI risk. There's lots of AI security frameworks out there that help you kind of like understand what I mentioned, some of those emerging risks, and how they have parallels with like risks that like most of our cyber and security teams understand quite well. Like Databricks has an AI security framework, but most companies do now. I think like Google has one, NIST has one, CSA has one. So, but yeah, I think I normally say, don't start from scratch, figure out what you already have. The first thing that I encourage companies to do is figure out a way to prioritize where to spend their time, and that relates to risk, essentially. And then try and find opportunities to de-dupe. So I read a great blog that Jacqueline wrote with Abby from Databricks about how how EU AI Act and DORA intersect and sometimes contradict, and how actually there could, as well as complexity, there could be opportunities to kind of say we only need one policy that covers this area of risk, and so try and find ways to kind of de-dupe the work that you need.
Yeah, makes sense. Simplifies,
just
right?
got one more point. So there's resource which could be useful. MIT has a whole list of categories of AI risk. So also some incidents which has happened recently. So that's helpful. And another thing is, sorry, not trying to sell my solution. It's not exactly the same thing, but using agentic AI to, lessen the workload. It's important to use AI as much as control AI.
That's right. Let's take a question. Anybody have a question? And I'm going to be the mic runner as the moderator. I should have recruited you, Tom. Nick left me.
Thanks. Tim Clements. If you look at the EU AI Act from a very high-level perspective, it's all about ensuring that AI systems are safe, respecting fundamental rights, transparent, and so on. That's from a very high level, and from my perspective, it's all about people, okay? Because we're talking about harms to people, harms to individuals, harms to society, groups of individuals. So how do you quantify those kinds of risk, a risk to people's fundamental rights? I mean, it's a similar question you could ask about, with GDPR. Same thing in terms of risks to the rights and freedoms of individuals. Can FAIR be used in that way to quantify those kinds of risks?
Yeah, great question. So I'm not sure about I've mainly looked at FAIR Air, which is kind of more about quantifying financial risk, I think, than quantifying kind of the individual risk. I agree with you that I think those are absolutely things that need to be done, and I think there isn't a kind of again deterministic framework for doing that. There's a lot of kind of evaluating the use case and kind of both. I guess there's two sides. Is the use case itself fair? The outcome that we're driving might be good for the company, but is it also fair for an individual? Which in some ways I would say hasn't really changed necessarily with AI. The fact that there's an AI regulation on it is a good thing, absolutely. But I think as corporate citizens, that's something that we should be doing. When we're implementing a system that determines whether someone can take out a loan or something, it should be fair. We should be doing everything that we can to make it fair. So I think there's the use case assessment, which shouldn't be completely new. As I said, we should have kind of legal teams that we can discuss with, people we're thinking of doing this use case. We're going to implement a credit scoring system. How do we make it fair to everyone? How do we make it legally kind of and ethically safe? And then I think there's the kind of the model training side and the what we actually build side, which there's kind of quite a lot of frameworks that you can use to detect bias and things like that. So is the model itself, the actions it's taking, fair and proportionate, which is kind of I would say a data science problem, or one that kind of needs to be solved technically. And then there's an ethical side that I think we should already have mechanisms in place to kind of make a judgment on. But I agree, I'm not aware of a specific framework that you can specifically fill out a sheet and it will give you a risk score, or say this is high risk, or I think in the Act itself it lists a subset of things. So if you're like using an AI model as part of a recruitment activity, for example, then it's probably high risk. And so those are quite easy, like to kind of like, I guess, categorize. Like the wider kind of like what is fair and unfair, I think still, and as I said, probably not new with AI, probably still needs better definition. I don't know.
Whatever you said.
Okay.
Sorry. I just want to add one tiny perspective from that. I think what generative AI has changed is it made it more relevant to a lot more people than just the organization. So in the past, when we do fair assessment, we can say, this is what my company does and what's relevant to us. But with generative AI, because it's so powerful and there's so many use cases, and there are a much more ethical element you have to consider. Am I doing really well for my company, but harmful for the society? So you do make a very good point. I think that's something that I don't think people have solved, to be honest.
And I think as well you have to consider that what we talked about, probabilistic versus deterministic, in terms of if you write kind of like a bit of code that takes actions based on certain thresholds, it's very easy to understand why someone got a credit score, right? Whereas with a probabilistic approach, it's trained on a set of data, and then it gets entirely new data, and like how it reacts to that new data is something we can infer a lot from training, and that's why the importance of kind of doing a lot of work during the training phase and validation phase. But then it's also the importance of continuing to monitor that and kind of like adapt it and retrain it where necessary, so that we haven't trained a model like 1 year and then there's a societal change that means that the data changes, which means the predictions change, and then a model that was perfectly fair a year ago suddenly becomes discriminatory. But yeah. Great question.
All right. Yeah, I'll add a little bit to this just to say that I think the challenge with AI that we're struggling with from a risk perspective is understanding what the loss event scenarios really are or could be. For fair, that has to be clearly defined, and we have a taxonomy for cyber. We do not yet have a taxonomy, I say we as in Fair Institute, for AI-related risk. But if you can define that loss event scenario clearly, and if you can understand the attributes of that, I think you absolutely could use it to measure risk. The answer may not be financial, though. For the company, it may be more financial, like you as the company that's providing the AI-based product or what have you. For society, it's different. It's not dollars, right? It's people's rights, like you said, and I think that requires a little bit different thinking. Maybe the same factors go into it, but the output's probably going to be different than, this will cost us a loss of, an annual loss expectancy of whatever, right? So it's fascinating, and I think we'll continue to talk about this and tackle it in different ways. I do want to thank the two of you. This was fantastic. Really appreciate the time you spent here, but also in the work that you and obviously Andrew, that you and Omar and Databricks have contributed to the work of the Fair Institute around AI risk. So I think we're just getting started, but really appreciate that. All right. Thank you.